This video was made possible by Morning Brew. A barrel of crude oil currently costs $103 US. That's the global average. For context, just 2 years ago, that same barrel of oil would have cost anywhere between $9 and $40. It's fluctuating like crazy, and is predicted to go even higher in the coming weeks, thanks to high demand and current geopolitical tensions. Now, these current prices seem like good news for oil-dependent regions like the Middle East, especially when you take into account that oil is the highest it's been since 2014. But that would be a wildly inaccurate statement, and the reasons for that are not what I expected. See, despite reports from the early and mid-2000s that made us think oil would dramatically dry up and lead to market crashes, the world is not running out of oil, at least not yet, and especially not for the Middle East. They have a lot of oil, and I mean a lot. Just take a look at the world's proven oil reserves from 2018. Middle Eastern nations take up 5 of the top 10 slots. Collectively, they make up 55% of the world's known oil reserves. What is changing, however, is the amount we use and how much we're willing to pay for it. See, as the world shifts to meet climate goals and alternative means of energy become cheaper, oil will become less of a daily necessity and more of a luxury option, if one at all. And that's a massive problem because the Middle East has so much oil. Just look at this map of oil reserves in the region. The green spots represent oil fields from Oman, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. The entire Persian Gulf is ripe with envious hydrocarbon resources, and if you combine this enormous abundance with less demand, prices will decrease, and eventually there will be so much oil that a lot of it simply can't be sold. And now it seems that the United States, the world's largest oil producer, is projected to increase oil production in 2022 and 2023. And this is something that will affect the Middle East directly. As for how I found out about this, well, I'll have to be honest. It was actually handed to me in my free daily newsletter from Morning Brew, who are sponsoring this video. But in that newsletter, I found something quite interesting. See, it turns out the Energy Information Administration projects that the US, which as you know is the world's largest oil producer, will fill 12 million barrels per day in 2022 and 12.6 million per day in 2023. For context, the US produced 11.2 million barrels per day in 2021. And this is a problem for the Middle East, as more oil is coming to market. As for how this will affect the Middle East directly, we'll just have to wait and see. But I can honestly say that without Morning Brew, I would have never found this information. And since Morning Brew takes all of the news regarding topics like science, technology, business, or finance, and compiles them into your inbox daily, it's easy to digest and gets you up to speed in just 5 minutes. So click the link in the description to sign up. It's free, and you can literally sign up in just 15 seconds. There's no reason not to. So thank you again to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video. Alright, so the Middle East has way too much oil, and it won't be able to sell it in the future. But what will the consequences of this be? Well, according to a 2020 controversial report published by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, it revealed that if the region does not diversify their economy, the collective $2 trillion financial wealth of the Gulf Cooperation Council nations, which are the countries marked out here, could be depleted as soon as 2034. What's worse though is that the IMF estimates global oil demand will peak by 2030 and decline from there, giving the Middle East not much time to diversify. But honestly speaking, these nations have known about their problematic situation for a while. It's why in 2016, highly controversial crown prince and de facto leader of the Saudi kingdom, Mohammed bin Salman, unveiled Saudi Vision 2030. This plan targeted 3 sections, namely the society, economy, and national development as a whole. One of the most notable and ambitious plans under Vision 2030 was to increase non-oil government revenue from $43.44 billion to $266.5 billion. Various programs would be set up to invest in the private sector and create jobs for the 70% of its 35 million population that is under 30, as well as raise the share of non-oil exports in non-oil GDP from 16 to 50%. The interesting thing about this though is that in a radical move, Mohammed bin Salman has previously announced a $2 trillion wealth fund that promised that by 2020 it would have diversified Saudi Arabia's economy completely and rid them of their dependence on oil. Obviously that didn't happen, but in 2021, stakes worth $20 billion from Aramco, a state-owned oil firm that's also the world's 3rd biggest oil company, was sold to an outside firm. This year, Aramco shares worth $80 billion were transferred to the Wealth Fund to further restructure the oil dominance. Still though, it's a far cry from the promised visions, and with less than 10 years to go, the country is way behind the timeline. It's a similar story in Kuwait, as it follows closely with an extreme oil dependency that supports 95% of the government's income and brings in 40% of the nation's $136 billion GDP. With 101.5 billion barrels of oil reserves and geological positioning that makes oil harvesting easier on them, it's easy to see why diversifying has been so hard, as it would be so much easier to just continue selling oil. But much like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait came up with the new Kuwait Vision 2035. But their approach is a bit different. Strangely enough, Kuwait is looking to further invest in harvesting oil and gas. The Kuwait Petroleum Corporation wants to invest $500 billion by 2040 to make hydrocarbon harvesting easier and less environmentally hazardous. Choosing not to ignore their dependency, Kuwait would rather increase oil output while there is still time and use the profits to build their country. They're also using public-private sector collaborations to fund these initiatives. But let's move on. Unlike its neighbors, Oman, a small monarchy bordered by Yemen, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, isn't as lucky. In the next 2 decades, Oman will run out of its current oil and gas reserves, so they don't have a choice or much time. Just take a look at the percentage of exports that came from hydrocarbons. It's pretty staggering. Hydrocarbon exports have generated anywhere from 68 to 85% of the government's yearly revenue for the past 30 years. Unlike Kuwait, Oman's geology doesn't do them any favors, making harvesting 4 times more expensive than its neighbor Saudi Arabia. Perhaps the biggest way they can diversify is by raising taxes and reducing their subsidies, but that obviously comes with a lot of sacrifices. Asking more from the public goes hand in hand with giving them more power, and that's not something the regime has handled well in the past. To truly see diversification of economies in action, Oman needs to look no further than their neighbor, the UAE. It's arguably the most well-known and visited country in the Middle East, and that's by design. You almost forget they are the 8th largest producer of oil in the world. While the entire country still counts on around 30% of their GDP to come from oil and gas output, 95% of Dubai's GDP is non-oil reliant. With originally lower oil reserves, Dubai sought to revolutionize its emirate into a tourist, IT and finance attraction. In the 90s there were but a few tourist-aimed hotels, and Abu Dhabi was far more recognizable, given its high oil reserves. Dubai used the revenue from their lesser reserves to boost their infrastructure and thus boost tourism and become a global hub for shopping, luxury, tech and finance. The IT and finance hubs brought jobs and international brands to the country. The UAE is a great example of how to diversify an economy away from oil, and in order for other Middle Eastern countries to beat their oil dependency, they have to open up as much as they possibly can and embrace the private sector, as well as some Western culture, to bring in foreign investment. Obviously, it's going to take some time, and these visions might not be as attainable in the short term, but diversification does need to happen, otherwise the riches will leave as quickly as they came. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.